Debt crisis. The debt crisis is described as a public debt owned by countries which can't pay their debts. This has a numerous effects on the nations, but we will talk about that later. First, it is important to understand why this happened. What are the factors and how did this happen? Experts enumerate three main causes: legacy of colonialism, odious debt, mismanaged spending of Western countries. Legacy of colonialism could be seen in three aspects: the political, the economical, and the sociocultural. Political, a factor is a flawed legacy. When achieving independence, nothing is easy, especially when a nation was built by colonizers joining small groups. When the colonizers leave, nationalism and cultural differences start breaking the nation apart. Suddenly, Group A sees they are not the same as Group B, nor as Group C. This often leads to disagreements on how the new government should be managed, leading to civil wars and political unrest. Having weak politics allows for stronger nations to manipulate the sovereignty of newly funded nations, making them dependent on their ideas and money. Economic causes include economic manipulation and having to pay the debt made by colonizers. This can be seen in the case of French colonies, Togo and Guinea. When Guinea demanded its independence, France decided to take out all the benefits French colonialism had brought on Guinea. Burning schools, hospitals, and killing the cattle, and even poisoning food were ways in which France sent a warning to the other countries that wanted independence. However, this didn't stop the independent movement in Africa. When Togo wanted their independence, they wanted to prevent the violence that happened on Guinea. So Sylvanus Olympio, who then became the first president of Togo, agreed that the Togolese Republic would pay an annual debt to France for the so-called benefits Togo got from the French colonization. It was the only way to keep the French from destroying the country before leaving. The only problem was the amount estimated by France was so huge that the annual repayment of the so-called colonial debt was so close to 40% of the country's budget in 1961 and almost half in the 1980s. Even today, more than 20 countries are still being economically oppressed by colonizers through a colonial pact that forces them to put many of their foreign reserves in the colonizers' central banks or their ministers of finance control. Sociocultural aspects include traditions or damaging ideologies left by colonizers, like the case of apartheid in South Africa, that still separates the country even after being outlawed. This creates more inequality inside the country, and when humanitarian interventions appear to solve these inequalities, they often leave a lot of debts inside the country. Odious debt is the second cause of debt crisis. Odious debt refers to when a nation lends money to a dictator or an incapable government. When the dictator or the corrupt government is taken out, the new government has to pay the debts. However, this is difficult as they have no resources to pay the high interest rates. Mismanaged spending of Western countries. In the 60s and 70s, USA paid for more than it had, so they decided to print more dollars. This lowered the value of the dollars, which made all countries sad, because the value of their oil was set in dollars. So they decided to increase the price of oil. This made the smaller countries ask for more and more money to other countries. Fearing an economic crisis, the IMF and the World Bank started lending more and more money. Sadly, most of this money went in hands of dictators rather than on developing smaller countries. At the end, the debt that USA created was set on small countries at high interest rates, which perpetuated the poverty cycle.
Nowadays, with the rise of globalization and neoliberalism, the states have a lot less intervention in economic matters, and more power is given to international organizations such as the IMF and the World Bank, who have been able to provide loans to states. The loans that they provide to developing countries can be very beneficial in order to get resources needed to promote economic growth and development. However, this has its costs, and in recent years it can be said that they outweigh the benefits. Once the NGOs realized that they could actually get a profit from the loan system started to be used as a tool to perpetuate the domination of developing states through financial imperialism. Developing nations have no option but to request loans since they can be found in a great state of need. However, these organizations have a very high interest rate, so these states that are already struggling have to pay back even more money than they originally took out. This creates some sort of dependency in the organisms and an incredibly high amount of debt, The nations end up becoming dependent of these loans in order to maintain even the most basic needs of their citizens. This makes it very difficult for the states to create any substantial change in their economic development. Another of its effects can be seen in the children. And in 1999, a report by UNICEF called The Progress of Nations suggested that debt is actually killing children. This can be seen when states divert resources from social programs in order to repay debt, and those most affected are the poor, especially children and women. If a state has to cut down on education expenditure, children will be able to receive an adequate education. And in addition, they can also cut back on social, health, environmental conservation, employment, and other important programs that promote the overall well-being of the citizen. In the case of environment, even though at first glance they may seem unrelated, debt can also cause issues in the environment. The more the developing state remains in debt, the more they feel like they need to milk the resources they have in the region in order to gain money that they bring. The World Wildlife Fund acknowledged the link between poverty and environmental issues. And one example of this is Brazil, whose debt with the IMF has severely affected a project to save the Amazon rainforest. And in addition, there are many situations where indigenous people have a lot of traditional knowledge about their environment and are the best maintainers of it. But when poverty is imposed on them and international trade agreements force them to abandon their traditions, a lot is lost. And essentially, excessive debt means that it becomes harder to sustain the environment.
Possible solutions. 1. Implementation of higher taxes. Through an orthodox perspective, increasing taxes can be recognized as a possible solution. By this, the government will be able to sustain itself without the necessity of extra help. It is known that a country enters into a debt crisis when the tax revenues of its government are less than its expenditures for a prolonged period. If a strict and good system of taxes is implemented since the beginning, the country will have a major probability to success. An obstacle to this solution observed from an alternative perspective, or, in other words, focused on the citizens' well-being, is that as the taxes raise, the poverty rate is also increased and the inequality line is widened. It also assumes that the citizens have money to pay more taxes, which may not be very realistic in a developing country. 2. Payback. Countries must pay back the money that is borrowed in order to be considered as reliable. When countries are identified as debtors, investors begin to raise their interest rates. This is because they, as investors, are risking huge quantities of money, so in order to ensure their gain, the interest must be really high. So, maintaining a good reputation in matters of debt will ensure the country's success. For example, South Korea. South Korea's effective loan is one of the best examples of how payback can avoid debt crisis. A drawback to the solution is that states that can't afford to pay back will fall back to high amounts of rates. 3. Establish an economic growth plan. Government must have a definite plan or idea of how to invest correctly the loan in order to use accurately the aid. As countries acquire a good strategy, they will increase their chance to achieve their development goal. A downside to this solution is that it is probable that a conflict, such as the one that arose with the Washington Consensus, may present. Trying to implement a set of guidelines for a state to follow will be very difficult because of the specific necessities of each state, the state's sovereignty, and their citizens. So, it is really difficult for a state to follow external guidelines.